Today we are going to explore one of the most fascinating secrets in the history of Christian art. The hidden codes that monks concealed within church paintings and illuminations throughout centuries of silence, devotion, and intellectual ingenuity. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. It was a time when the walls spoke, not with written words for any passerby to decipher, but with a silent language, woven in pigments and gold, in symbols disguised among saints and angels, in geometries carefully inserted beneath the apparent simplicity of sacred scenes. Medieval Europe was a continent where the overwhelming majority of men and women had never learned to read. Cathedrals, monasteries, and the small stone churches scattered across fields and mountains were, to the common people, open books, the only possible access to the stories of the Bible, the theology of the Church, and the invisible universe of the sacred. But to a select group of men consecrated to a life of silence, prayer, and study, these very images held much more than appeared on the surface. They were ciphered messages, spiritual maps, secret conversations between learned minds across generations. To understand why these men felt the need to hide messages on the walls of churches and in the illustrated pages of sacred books, one must first understand who they were and the world they lived in. Medieval monks were not mere religious men withdrawn from the tumult of the world. They were often the only guardians of human knowledge in an era of profound instability. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, much of the knowledge accumulated by Greek and Roman antiquity was dispersed or lost forever. Wars, invasions, and the political fragmentation of Europe destroyed libraries, schools, and centers of culture. What survived found refuge, almost exclusively, in monasteries. It was within those walls that men such as Bede the Venerable, in 7th century England, or Alcuin of York, advisor to Charlemagne in the 8th century, preserved and transmitted classical knowledge to the following generations. Monasteries housed copying offices called scriptoria, silent rooms where monks hunched for hours on end over parchment, patiently and monumentally reproducing biblical texts, philosophical treatises, poems, encyclopedias, and medical books. It was grueling work, performed under insufficient natural light in the intense cold of winter, with inks prepared by hand from minerals, plants, and even insects. And from this meticulous work, something far beyond mere copying emerged: creation. The most important scriptoria of medieval Europe, such as those at the monastery of Lindisfarne in England, Saint Gall in Switzerland, Monte Cassino in Italy, and Cluny in France, developed their own styles, distinct visual languages that identified them as clearly as a name. The illuminating monks, so called because their paintings seemed to light up the pages with gold and vivid colors, became, over the centuries, true artists. But they were artists of a special kind, artists whose work served the glory of God, whose labor was simultaneously an act of devotion and a sophisticated form of communication. And when these men needed to communicate something they could not or dared not say openly, they turned to the only instrument they mastered with absolute skill: the visual language. The first great code that the monks developed and expanded was the language of symbols. It was not an invention exclusive to them, but a heritage that dated back to the early Christians, who met in catacombs and needed to identify one another without arousing the suspicions of the Roman authorities. The fish, the lamb, the dove, the alpha, and the omega, these symbols were the first of a long tradition of ciphered communication within Christian art. Medieval monks inherited this legacy and expanded it in extraordinary ways, creating a visual vocabulary of a complexity that would take centuries to be fully understood. The book as a sacred object was, in itself, a space of secrets. The Evangeliaries, books containing the 4 Gospels of the New Testament, were among the most venerated objects of a monastic community, bound in precious leather or carved ivory, adorned with gemstones kept in special boxes called theca. These books were carried in procession, touched with calculated reverence, and kissed during the liturgy. But their inner pages held something beyond the sacred texts: the illuminations, the miniature paintings that decorated the drop caps, the borders, and entire pages dedicated to depictions of the evangelists or scenes from the life of Christ. And it was in these illuminations that the monks could speak with the most freedom. One of the most dazzling examples of this phenomenon is the Livre de Kells, produced by Irish Celtic monks around the year 800. Considered by many the most beautiful illuminated manuscript in the world, the Livre de Kells is much more than an art object. Its pages contain interlaced lines so complex that, when modern researchers tried to reproduce them with technical drawing instruments, they realized the geometric precision was impossible to achieve without tools that medieval monks, in theory, did not possess. Upon examining these interlacements more closely, scholars discovered something disturbing. Hidden in the dense forest of lines and spirals were human figures, fantastic animals, faces, creatures that seemed to emerge and disappear as the angle of vision changed. It was no accident. It was pure intent. What did the monks of the scriptorium of Iona or of Kells want to communicate with these faces hidden among the ornaments? Interpretations are varied, and none is definitive. Some scholars believe the hidden figures represented angels or guardian spirits, invisible to the inattentive eye but present to those who knew how to see with the necessary slowness. Others suggest they were veiled portraits of the illuminating monk himself, a way of signing a work that, out of religious humility, could not be signed openly. There was also a very specific tradition, that of including figures that only became visible when the book was read in a certain direction, under a certain light, creating an apparition effect that reinforced the mystical aura of the sacred object. To the monks who created these images, the invisible was as real as the visible, and art was the portal between the two worlds. But the secrets were not only in the manuscripts. They also inhabited the walls, ceilings, floors, and stained glass of medieval churches and cathedrals. As Europe emerged from the instability of the post-Roman centuries and entered the period we now call the High Middle Ages, churches became increasingly elaborate, and the paintings that decorated them became increasingly rich in layered meanings. Iconographic programs, the systematic planning of which images would appear in which parts of a church, were developed by theologians and abbots, not by common artists. The painters who executed the works on the walls or wooden panels were often the monks themselves or craftsmen, directly supervised by them. The arrangement of images in a medieval church was not random. It followed a precise theological logic, established and passed down from generation to generation. The high altar was always to the east, toward the rising sun, a symbol of the resurrection of Christ. Images of the Last Judgment were invariably placed on the west wall, above the main door, the last thing the faithful would see upon leaving, a permanent and eloquent reminder of the fate of souls. The vaults represented heaven, the tympanums and outer portals communicated the celestial hierarchy, and the side aisles told in narrative sequence the stories of the patron saints. All of this was part of a code that the simpler faithful absorbed intuitively, without necessarily understanding it in depth, like a child who learns to read faces before learning to read words. But within this visible structure shared by all, there were deeper layers, accessible only to those who possessed the right key. And the key, often, was knowledge of the Christian numerological tradition. Numbers, in the medieval worldview, were not neutral mathematical abstractions. They were elements charged with spiritual meaning, bearers of divine messages that any scholar would recognize immediately. The number 3 represented the Holy Trinity. 4 symbolized the 4 evangelists, the 4 cardinal directions, and the 4 fundamental elements. 7 was the number of perfection, 7 days of creation, 7 sacraments, 7 deadly sins. 12 evoked the apostles and the tribes of Israel. And 40, the number of years the Hebrew people spent in the desert and the days Christ spent fasting, was the universal symbol of trial and purification. The monks incorporated these numbers into paintings in ways that defy the casual perception of those who merely glance at them. A scene of the Last Supper might include, carefully arranged among the objects on the table, exactly 12 elements besides the participants, a direct reference to the apostles, but also a number that, in the philosophical tradition known to medieval monks, carried other overlapping meanings. The windows of a cathedral could be divided into groups of 3, 7, or 12, not only for aesthetic reasons, but because each number summoned a specific theological reality that the attentive observer would recognize. And the monks who designed these programs knew exactly what they were doing. Sacred geometry was another fundamental instrument in this secret vocabulary. The idea that certain mathematical proportions possessed a spiritual dimension was not a medieval invention. It dated back to the Greek philosopher Pythagoras, who believed that numbers were the essence of all things, and to Plato, who in the Timaeus described the creation of the universe as an act of divine geometry. These thoughts reached the Middle Ages through different channels, through Boethius, through St. Augustine, and through the Neoplatonic texts that circulated in the most erudite monasteries of Europe. And they found expression in the proportions of Gothic cathedrals, in the divisions of tympanums and capitals, and in the paintings that the monks produced with such dedication. The golden ratio, that specific proportion, approximately 1.618, which Greek mathematicians called phi, and which appears repeatedly in nature, in the spirals of seashells, in the patterns of flowers, and in the proportions of the human body, was known and used by medieval monks, although they did not call it by that name. In illuminated manuscripts, the layout of the figures, the relative size of the characters, and the proportion between the space occupied by text and images frequently obeyed this ratio without it ever being stated or explained anywhere. It was a language inscribed in the deep structure of the work, perceptible only to those who knew where to look and with what patience to gaze. But there were also cases where the codes were less philosophical and more urgently practical. The Middle Ages were not a period of freedom of expression. The Church controlled public discourse with increasing rigor, and those who dared to question established dogmas ran serious risks. Heresies, beliefs that deviated from official doctrine, were combated with increasing violence as the medieval period progressed. The Cathars, in the south of France, were exterminated in a bloody crusade at the beginning of the 13th century. The Waldensians were persecuted for decades, and just as people in authoritarian regimes developed coded languages to communicate more safely, medieval people who needed to express heterodox ideas learned to disguise them in images. There is no definitive proof that organized heretical groups systematically used church paintings to transmit secret messages. The popular narrative that associates the Templars, the Cathars, and various secret orders with a network of hidden symbols in medieval churches belongs more to contemporary fiction than to verifiable history, but there is evidence of individual cases, of monks or craftsmen who hid in the works they produced critical commentaries on the institution that employed them, references to internal monastery conflicts or expressions of doubt and questioning that could not be openly verbalized. These cases, when discovered by historians, shed an unexpected light on the tensions and contradictions of medieval religious life. An example frequently cited by specialists in medieval iconography is the phenomenon of marginal images in illuminated manuscripts of the 13th and 14th centuries. The margins of religious manuscripts, those spaces around the sacred text that theoretically should have remained blank or been decorated with discrete motifs, became in this period the stage for a surprising subversive art. Knights fighting giant snails, rabbits hunting their hunters, monkeys dressed as monks celebrating masses, clerics drinking and dancing. These grotesque and often humorous images coexisted on the same page with texts of profound religious solemnity. For a long time, historians treated these margins as mere entertainment, as a release valve for the humor of bored monks. But a more careful analysis has revealed layers of meaning that go far beyond simple jest. The margins of medieval manuscripts were a space of relative freedom, a border zone between the sacred and the profane, where certain things could be said without the consequences that the same statements would have if made directly. The monks who drew a monkey dressed as an abbot were not simply having fun. They were commenting, in a veiled but recognizable way to their readers, on the corruption or frivolity of certain members of the clergy. The rabbits hunting hunters could be a satirical inversion of power relations, a commentary on the hypocrisy of nobles who hunted animals while they should have been occupied with higher matters, and the knights fighting snails, a motif that appears in dozens of different manuscripts from all over Europe, still generates lively debate among specialists. It could be a comic reference to cowardly nobility, a metaphor for the slowness of justice, or even a symbol whose full meaning has been lost to time. What these examples reveal is that medieval art, very frequently described as rigid and conventional, was in fact a space of extraordinary creativity and surprising complexity. The monks who produced it operated within strict conventions, but within those conventions they found loopholes, inversions, and subtle deviations that transformed images into vehicles for multiple messages. For the common believer entering a church and seeing a fresco depicting the Virgin Mary, there was a clear and edifying message: the Mother of God, a model of purity and intercessor for sinners. But for the learned monk who spent years studying iconography, there were other overlapping meanings: references to philosophical texts, veiled citations of pagan authors, commentaries on contemporary theological debates, and sometimes critical messages about the clergy itself or the institutions of temporal power. Colors were another fundamental encoding system in medieval art. The choice of colors was not aesthetic in the modern sense of the term. It was not a matter of taste or personal style. Colors had precise and widely shared meanings within the community of artists and theologians. Gold represented divine light, heavenly glory, and eternity not measured in time. Blue was the color of the Virgin Mary, associated with the sky and unattainable purity. Red could signify the blood of Christ, martyrdom, or the fire of the Holy Spirit. Green symbolized hope and the regeneration of nature. White was the color of resurrection and absolute purity. And black, curiously, was not always a symbol of death and mourning. In some monastic contexts, especially in the more austere orders like the Benedictines, black represented humility and renunciation of the material world. But colors also functioned as a code in a more specific and precise sense. In certain medieval iconographic traditions, the inversion of habitual colors was a deliberate sign that something was wrong in a theological or moral sense. A biblical character, who usually appeared in blue being represented in green, could indicate a moral fall, a betrayal, or an association with heresy. Scholars who knew the code identified the message immediately. Lay people simply perceived that something about that figure made them uncomfortable, without necessarily knowing why. It was a communication that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. For different audiences, with different degrees of sophistication, the same image delivered completely distinct messages. There is also the fascinating phenomenon of astronomical and calendrical images hidden in medieval churches. Monks were, among other things, practical astronomers. The need to accurately calculate the dates of religious holidays, especially Easter, whose date changes each year according to a lunar cycle of great complexity, required considerable astronomical knowledge. And this knowledge often found expression in churches in ways that remain surprising to this day. In several medieval cathedrals, especially those in France and Italy, the arrangement of windows and roof openings was calculated so that, on certain days of the year, the solstices, the equinoxes, the days of important liturgical calendar feasts, a beam of sunlight hits exactly a specific point on the floor or a mural, creating an effect that seems supernatural, but is, in fact, the result of highly precise mathematical calculations. These architectural sundials were, at the same time, practical instruments, demonstrations of scientific knowledge, and theological affirmations about the perfect order of the universe created by God. The Chartres Cathedral in France is perhaps the most studied example of a construction where the hidden knowledge of medieval builders, many of them directly associated with monastic communities and the learned clergy, manifests itself in a truly extraordinary way. Its floor labyrinths, its stained glass with its specific palette of blues whose formulas have yet to be completely reproduced, its sculptures carefully arranged on the portals, the exact proportions of its main nave. All of this has been the object of decades of research by mathematicians, astronomers, theologians, and art historians. And the conclusion that many have reached is that Chartres is, among other things, a book of stone in which generations of builders inscribed in 3 dimensions a complete system of philosophical and theological thought that goes far beyond what any text could make explicit. The labyrinth of Chartres deserves special attention in this narrative. Traced on the floor of the central nave in stones of alternating colors, It is the only complete medieval labyrinth still intact in a European cathedral. Many others were destroyed in later renovations in the 18th and 19th centuries. With its 11 meters in diameter and its single path which, despite appearing random, always leads to the center with no dead ends, the labyrinth served multiple functions. It was used as a symbolic substitute for physical pilgrimages to Jerusalem. Traversing it on one's knees was equivalent in terms of indulgences to a part of the journey to the Holy Land. But it was also a meditation on the nature of time, space, and the spiritual journey of the human soul. And there was also an astronomical aspect. At the center of the labyrinth there was originally a copper plate which, on certain days of the year, was illuminated by the sun in a precise manner. The plate is now missing, but modern researchers have been able to calculate exactly on which days this phenomenon occurred, and those days corresponded to dates of the medieval religious calendar of primordial importance. The question that naturally arises as these examples accumulate is, why? Why would these men dedicate so much energy, so much ingenuity, so much time to hiding messages in images? The simplest answer is also the most profound, because for medieval monks, the visible world was only the surface of a much richer and multidimensional reality. Medieval theology, deeply influenced by Neoplatonism, the philosophical tradition that viewed the material world as an imperfect reflection of eternal spiritual realities, taught that visible things were signs of invisible ones, that the entire nature was a text written by God, a system of symbols that the human being had to learn to read with attention and humility. In this context, creating an image full of hidden meanings was not just an intellectual artifice or an elite game. It was an act of reverence, an attempt to imitate in human work the infinite depth of the divine work. There was a specific period between the 11th and 13th centuries that represents perhaps the pinnacle of this tradition of occult codes in European monastic art. It was the period of the so-called Gregorian Reform, when the Catholic Church underwent a profound internal reorganization, and of the subsequent expansion of the monastic movement with the founding of new religious orders. Among them, the Cistercians, founded with the impetus of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century, represent one of the most fascinating contradictions of this history. Saint Bernard preached the most absolute austerity in religious art. His monasteries were to be stripped of all superfluous ornamentation, without elaborate paintings, without unnecessary sculptures. Yet at the same time, he was one of the most sophisticated thinkers of his time, a man for whom the invisible was constantly more real than the visible. And paradoxically, the austerity he imposed on the Cistercians ended up functioning as a code in itself. The absence of ornamentation was in itself a message, a theological statement, a critique of the ostentatious riches of the Church of Rome. The orders that did not follow Cistercian austerity, notably the Benedictines and later the Franciscans and Dominicans, developed iconographic traditions that were increasingly elaborate and dense with meaning. The Benedictines of Monte Cassino and Cluny produced works of extraordinary visual richness, where every detail had its specific purpose. The Franciscans, committed to a vision of Christ as a suffering human being with whom the poor could directly identify, brought a new emotional realism to religious art that also carried its own layers of meaning. And the Dominicans, the order of preachers, developed an iconography especially aimed at the instruction of the faithful, without failing to include in it deeper layers intended for the learned, who knew how to look beyond the obvious. It was in the Dominican context that the work of one of the most extraordinary medieval thinkers flourished. Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 13th century and whose Summa Theologica attempted to synthesize all of Christian theology with the philosophy of Aristotle, creating a system of thought of unprecedented complexity and breadth. What many do not know is that Thomas Aquinas wrote extensively about religious images, about the function of art in the transmission of divine knowledge, about the relationship between the visible and the invisible in human experience. For him, images were necessary for three declared reasons: to instruct the illiterate, to fix the mysteries of the faith in the memory, and to awaken affection and devotion. But implicit in this analysis was a fourth function that Thomas did not name directly, that of preserving and transmitting knowledge among the learned, in ways that would escape the control of power and the erosion of time. The concept of ars memoriae, the art of memory, was central to medieval intellectual culture and deserves to be examined with attention in this narrative. Inherited from Roman rhetoricians, especially Cicero and Quintilian, the art of memory was a technique of mental organization that consisted of associating information with images and locations in an imaginary space, the so-called memory palace. For a medieval monk who spent hours meditating on the paintings in his church, these images were not mere decorations. They were the nodes of a mnemonic network, the anchor points of a vast system of interconnected knowledge. When the monk's gaze traversed the frescoes of the apse, the curved part of the building behind the altar, he was not simply contemplating visual beauty. He was mentally traversing the architecture of a theological system, recalling texts, connecting ideas, navigating an invisible library that existed only in the relationship between the images and the trained mind that contemplated them. Hildegard von Bingen is perhaps the most dramatic and well-documented example of a medieval thinker who used visual imagery as a repository of complex knowledge and as a form of expression that went far beyond what the texts of the period could contain. Abbess, theologian, composer, naturalist, and visionary, Hildegard lived in the 12th century in the Rhine Valley, in present-day Germany, and throughout her long life produced an extraordinary body of work that includes medical treatises, musical compositions of singular beauty, letters to popes and emperors, and a set of mystical visions that she herself transformed into images with the help of a scribe and an artist. These images, cosmograms, diagrams of the universe, representations of the relationship between God, humanity, and nature, are at once medieval art, natural philosophy, and a visual code of a sophistication that researchers are still deciphering with the tools of our day. Hildegard describes in her visions an egg-shaped universe with the earth at the center and layers of air, ether, and fire surrounding it, a cosmology that blends Christian elements with observations that seem to anticipate, in symbolic form, concepts that would only be scientifically articulated centuries later. Researcher Barbara Newman from Northwestern University has dedicated decades to the study of this work and concluded that Hildegard's images functioned as a kind of alternative language, capable of expressing insights into the nature of the universe and human experience that the conventional theological language of her time simply could not contain. The recourse to vision, Hildegard presented her ideas as divine revelations, not as personal speculation, was in part a rhetorical strategy, a way to provide authority and protection to ideas that, if expressed directly, might have been met with skepticism or institutional hostility. An aspect frequently neglected regarding the secrets in medieval paintings is the role that Jewish and Islamic tradition played in shaping the visual vocabulary of Christian monks. The European Middle Ages, despite its rhetoric of exclusion and its violence against Jews and Muslims, was also a period of intense intellectual exchange among the three great religious traditions of the Mediterranean. In the 12th century, especially in the Iberian Peninsula and Sicily, where Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived in relative proximity, an extraordinary amount of philosophical, scientific, and mystical knowledge was translated from Arabic into Latin and circulated through European monasteries. Texts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, including works by Averroes, Avicenna, and the Jewish physician and philosopher Maimonides, reached the monks' tables and opened windows to traditions of thought completely different from the Christian one. From the Jewish tradition, the monks absorbed elements of the Kabbalah, the mystical current of Judaism that sees in the structure of the letters and numbers of the Hebrew biblical text a key to the secrets of the universe. Gematria, a Kabbalistic technique that assigns numerical values to the letters of the Hebrew alphabet and uses these values to find hidden connections between words and concepts, influenced the numerology that medieval monks used in their works. The technique of reading a text on multiple simultaneous levels, literal, allegorical, moral, and anagogical, which Thomas Aquinas systematized as the four senses of Scripture, had roots in both the rabbinic and Greco-Roman traditions. And the idea that the universe was structured by a divine mathematical logic that the human mind could partially decipher resonated deeply with the Neoplatonism that Christian monks inherited from Plato and the Church Fathers. From the Islamic tradition came equally fundamental contributions. Islamic geometry, with its complex patterns and tessellations that could extend indefinitely without repeating, the arabesques, exerted a visible influence on the decorative art of medieval European manuscripts of the 12th and 13th centuries. The interlacing patterns of the Book of Kells, for example, present structural similarities to patterns found in Islamic manuscripts, suggesting channels of exchange that conventional history often minimizes. The tradition of using seemingly simple images and narratives to convey complex spiritual teachings also reverberated, at least indirectly, in the more cosmopolitan monastic circles of medieval Europe. But there are also cases where the code in medieval paintings serves a completely different purpose. Not spiritual, not political, but simply and deeply human. The monks who spent decades producing manuscripts were human beings with personalities, affections, frustrations, and humor. The marginal notes they sometimes left on the parchment, small annotations written in the margins of the texts they were copying, which researchers call colophons, reveal an inner world surprisingly vivid and close to our own. "What a sore hand! What a difficult text! What a heavy letter!" wrote an anonymous copyist in some scriptorium of the early medieval centuries. "It is cold today, the candle is running out and my eyes ache," noted another in similar circumstances. These moments of raw humanity, hidden in the margins of sacred texts, are themselves a form of code, the message of a real human being, inserted within an object of impersonal devotion, like a note tucked inside a prayer book. And sometimes the code was literally a hidden layer. Researchers who have studied medieval manuscripts with high-tech imaging equipment, infrared cameras, ultraviolet light, and tomography have discovered, in some cases, text written under the visible illumination, content that was covered up, but which modern technology can partially recover. These underlying texts reveal, in some instances, erasures of previous versions. The copyist had written something, changed their mind, covered it with ink and started over from scratch. But in other cases, what is hidden under the paint is deliberately different from what is visible on top, as if the artist had made the conscious decision to keep one layer of meaning under another, knowing that the technology of their time could not reveal it. In the 12th and 13th centuries, particularly in the region of what is now France, there was an explosion of a specific type of decorative image that medievalists call leaf masks. Human faces emerging from leaves, twigs, and ornamental branches that decorated columns, capitals, and the borders of manuscripts. These images, known in English as the Green Man, are found in practically every medieval church and cathedral in Western Europe, and remain one of the greatest enigmas of the iconography of that period. The Green Man does not appear in any medieval theological text. There is no canonical explanation for his presence in sacred spaces. The very monks who sculpted and painted him left no written explanation of what he meant or why they placed him there. Modern researchers have proposed numerous interpretations for the Green Man, that it is a survival of pre-Christian fertility cults absorbed by medieval Christianity as it expanded across the European countryside, that it represents nature as God's creation, inserted into sacred space, to remind us that the natural world also belongs to the divine, that it is a symbol of resurrection, of the cycle of death and renewal that vegetation embodies each spring, that it is a representation of the chaotic forces that lurk in the natural world and against which the Christian must guard. None of these interpretations is definitive, and it is possible that the absence of a textual explanation is itself a message, that the Green Man was an intentionally ambiguous symbol, an invitation to meditation and personal interpretation, a space of openness amidst the rigorous system of prescribed meanings of official Christian iconography. What is certain is that the foliate heads multiplied in the 12th and 13th centuries with a speed and ubiquity that suggest a conscious choice, a trend that spread through the ateliers and scriptoria of all of Europe with remarkable speed for an age in which communication was slow. Someone, at some time and place, decided that these images belonged in churches, and that decision was replicated by hundreds of artists in thousands of works scattered across the continent. What message did they want to convey? Perhaps there was no single message, but rather a space of deliberate polysemy, a fragment of mystery inserted into the heart of dogmatic clarity, a reminder that even within the most rigorous system of beliefs, there is always something that escapes complete definition. Modern technology has been an unexpected and extraordinarily powerful ally in deciphering medieval codes. Infrared and ultraviolet cameras reveal layers of paint invisible to the naked eye, showing how works of art were modified and repainted over the centuries, and sometimes revealing underlying layers that restorers did not know existed. Computed tomography allows for the examination of the interior of sculptures and painted panels without destroying them, revealing internal structures and construction techniques that were atelier secrets transmitted orally from master to apprentice. And the chemical analysis of pigments makes it possible to precisely date the different layers of a painting and identify where the materials came from, information that helps track the trade routes and cultural exchanges of the Middle Ages with a precision previously impossible. But the most transformative technology is perhaps the massive digitization of historical collections. As libraries and museums around the world have made their collections of medieval manuscripts available online, it has become possible for the first time to compare works from different regions and periods quickly and systematically, identifying patterns and connections that could once only be detected by researchers who spent years traveling from library to library. This comparative work has led to discoveries that individual research could hardly achieve. The identification of specific ateliers, the location of lost manuscripts, and the deciphering of symbol systems that only reveal themselves when a sufficient number of examples can be gathered and examined together. The transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance brought a gradual shift in this tradition of hidden codes. With the rise of humanism, the expansion of literacy, and most significantly, the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450, access to written knowledge was democratized in a way unprecedented in human history. The knowledge that monks had guarded and transmitted through copies, patiently produced in scriptoria, and which they had encoded in images to protect or selectively communicate, became progressively more accessible to a wider audience. Printed books could be produced in hundreds or thousands of copies, could circulate more widely, and could be read by an increasing number of people in different places at the same time. The need to hide knowledge within images diminished, though it never completely disappeared. The legacy of the medieval monks endured, however, in unexpected and lasting ways. The tradition of embedding hidden meanings in visual works continued in Renaissance art and well beyond. Leonardo da Vinci, who lived between 1452 and 1519, in the midst of the transition between the medieval and the modern, is often cited as a direct heir to this tradition. His notebooks, filled with observations written from right to left in mirror-reversed script, are the most famous example of an artist and scientist who deliberately obscured his records to control who could access them. And his paintings remain the subject of analyses that find in them layers of meaning that go far beyond what is immediately visible to any viewer. Leonardo's paintings remain the subject of analyses that find in them layers of meaning that go far beyond what is immediately visible. The Last Supper, painted in Milan between 1495 and 1498, has sparked countless interpretations that identify within it gestures, character placements, and object arrangements charged with meanings beyond the obvious narrative, a direct inheritance of the medieval tradition of incorporating multiple levels of reading into a single image. This lack of consensus, which persists after 5 centuries of study, is in itself the most eloquent proof that medieval and Renaissance artists were masters of deliberate ambiguity, of the message that unfolds in layers for different readers and in different eras. The modern rediscovery of these codes is in itself a story that deserves to be told. The systematic interest in what historians call iconology, the study of the deep meaning of artistic images, began in an organized fashion at the beginning of the 20th century with the work of art historian Aby Warburg and his disciple Erwin Panofsky. Warburg, who founded the influential Warburg Institute in Hamburg, spent his life trying to understand how symbols and images carry meanings across time and cultures. Panofsky developed a systematic method that distinguished three layers of meaning in a work of art: what the image literally shows, what it represents within a conventional tradition of meanings, and what it expresses about the values and worldviews of its time. This method definitively transformed the way researchers approach medieval art. Instead of viewing church paintings as simple illustrations of biblical texts intended for an illiterate audience, scholars began to see them as complex documents that record in visual form the state of theological, philosophical, and scientific thought of their time. And in doing so, they began to systematically uncover the hidden layers that medieval monks had so carefully inserted into their works. The discovery was neither dramatic nor sudden. It was the slow, patient work of generations of researchers who spent decades in the world's libraries and museums, examining manuscripts with magnifying glasses and scanners, comparing works from different periods and regions, and consulting theological and philosophical texts that had remained obscure for centuries. It was discovered, for example, that the fresco cycle of the Upper Basilica of Assisi in Italy, attributed to Giotto or his school and painted in the late 13th century, contains, beyond its evident biographical narrative, a series of references to internal theological debates within the Franciscan order that were ongoing precisely during the period when the frescoes were painted. Certain iconographic choices that seemed like mere narrative details revealed themselves, upon closer examination, to be stances taken in doctrinal disputes of great importance to the order. The Franciscans were divided between the so-called spirituals, who advocated for absolute poverty in literal imitation of Christ, and the conventuals, who accepted a greater degree of material property for the institution. In the frescoes of Assisi, researchers identified signs: the presence or absence of certain objects, the visual treatment of certain figures that function as indicators of positioning in relation to this dispute. Today, at the beginning of the 21st century, the understanding of codes in medieval paintings is more advanced than it has ever been at any previous time, and at the same time, it is clearer than ever that we have not come close to deciphering everything there is to be deciphered. With each generation of researchers that pores over medieval manuscripts and frescoes, new secrets emerge, not because medieval monks were more intelligent than us, but because they operated within a worldview, a belief system, and a set of cultural references that is genuinely different from our own, and which continually surprises us when we encounter an echo of it in something completely unexpected. What the medieval monks left us is not just a corpus of beautiful art and a set of sophisticated techniques that continue to inspire artists and architects. It is a lesson on the human capacity to find ways to communicate what cannot be said directly, to preserve what is in danger of being lost, and to create beauty and depth within the most severe constraints. In isolated monasteries, under vows of silence and obedience with limited material resources, and in a world that could be brutally hostile to independent thought, these men and women found ways to speak beyond the walls of their monasteries, beyond the borders of their time. To readers who would live centuries later and who, armed with tools they could not imagine, would finally be able to hear what they were saying with such care and dedication. There is something profoundly touching about this idea, that an illuminated manuscript, produced by an anonymous monk in the scriptorium of an Irish monastery in the 9th century, still has things to say to us today, that the messages he hid among the golden interlacing still await eyes patient enough to find them. And there is something, too, that invites us to humility, that of recognizing that our ability to read these messages is always partial, always mediated by our own cultural assumptions, always incomplete. Medieval monks tried to decipher the text of the universe, and we try to decipher the text they left behind. It is a process that never ends, and that is all the richer the more people dedicate themselves to it with curiosity and openness. If this journey through the secrets of medieval walls has stirred in you the same curious restlessness that moves the researchers who dedicate their lives to this work, then this narrative has fulfilled its purpose, just as the monks hid messages for those who knew how to listen closely. Each video on this channel is an invitation to look beyond the surface of things and discover what time has kept for those who know how to search. Subscribe to the channel and become part of this community of people who still today listen to the voices that the centuries could not silence. If the story of these men who turned painting into message, stone into library, and silence into conversation has touched something within you, leave a like. It is the simplest gesture to say that this narrative has reached where it needed to reach. And in the comments, share which detail of this story surprised you the most, which secret you wish we had explored further, which question remained unanswered. Because just as the medieval monks knew, the richest discoveries always happen when many minds meet around the same mystery.